everything you said about me, Tim, is doubly true for you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. It really is. What a wonderful group of human beings and sisters and brothers in God's family. Let's go ahead as we start. Take a few minutes to get quiet. You know, we're such curious creatures. We somehow live in this outer world, and they tell us we have this entire huge and very important interior world that's going on all the time, where the spirit is active. So let's take a few minutes and get quiet. Open up to receive the ministry that's coming through to us in each moment. The ministry of God's presence inside of us, the indwelling adjuster, the presence of the Father, the ministries of the infinite Spirit through the person of our universe Mother Spirit, our Mother, in this local part of the cosmos, and we're going to be getting to know her more and more fully, and her wonderful angels who are ministering to us in this moment, stimulating our spiritual inspiration, getting us deeper, trying to make connections for us. And also the presence of the Master, Jesus. I mean, we're here to talk today, to think about how he did miracles in people's lives, right? How he ministered, how he touched them, and how he changed them so that their lives forever afterwards were transformed. And he's here now, inside of us, doing the same thing. So let's take a few moments to rest into the interior place where the Father and our angels, Mother Spirit, and the Master himself are working and joining with us. Let's take a few moments in worship and quiet contemplation. Thank you. You know, I couldn't help but thinking as I was there communing a little bit, is what came to mind is a story of John Wesley, and I don't know how many of you know John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, key founder of Methodism. And the story is that he would hold many of his rallies out in nature, in the countryside, and when the crowds were gathered, he would be in the woods, not hiding, but just on his own in the woods. And when he felt sufficiently moved by the Spirit, he would rush out and begin to address the crowd. So I couldn't help thinking, you know, give me a little bit of that, John, from wherever you are. So again, welcome. Our focus this afternoon is on how Jesus engaged in his personal ministry, in the work that he did one-on-one with individual spiritual seekers. And I'd like to start with one of my favorite passages in part 4. Oops. There we go. Thanks. I might cue you, Tim, on that. Gawryn was by this time beginning to learn how his tutor spent his leisure in this unusual personal ministry to his fellows. So this was not common practice. This really struck Gawryn, how unusual this activity was. And the young lad set about to find out the motive. Why was Jesus doing this? The motive for these incessant activities. And I think that's part of what was so unusual about this. Jesus was always doing this, constantly. He was sensitive to the people around him, and he picked up any time there was an opportunity to connect with a human being and accomplish these things. He would move immediately into connection, communion with them. So he set about trying to find out why Jesus was engaged in these constant activities. And he approached Jesus, he said, "Why do you occupy yourself so continuously with these visits with strangers?" And Jesus answered, Gawryn, "No man is a stranger to one who knows God." So there's an important first clue, and he follows it up. In the experience of finding the Father in heaven, you discover that all men are your brothers. So there's a linkage here that's really inseparable, right? Where do we find the motivation, the desire to constantly be finding people, getting to know them, loving them, and ministering to them? I don't think it happens without the first part of the equation, which is we immerse ourselves in God's presence. We feel the Father's presence with us, and it's out of that immersion, out of that the energy, the motivation, the desire comes to love the people that we encounter around us. In the experience of finding the Father, and I don't think that's a single one-time experience. I think our purpose, our need, is to find a way to be engaged in that finding, in that rooting, in that grounding of God's presence inside all the time. And when we reach for that ideal, then the motivation, the why of our connecting with people and ministering to them begins to flow in us naturally, automatically. We don't have to make it happen. It flows from our immersion in relationship with God. And then Jesus went on to say, not only do you discover that all men are your brothers in this immersion in God's presence. And he said, does it seem strange that one should enjoy the exhilaration of meeting a newly discovered brother or sister? Exhilaration. He was excited to meet people. He would get all jazzed about it. And I think that comes naturally from being rooted and immersed in God's presence. We forget ourselves and we allow the energy of God, the love that God has for each person that we meet to flow through us, to come out of us, and for us to become agents or conduits, in a sense, for that presence of God coming through us. He went on to say, to become acquainted with one's brothers and sisters. And then there's an interesting parenthetical phrase, to know their problems and to learn to love them. So becoming acquainted with them means learning they're struggling with, what's going on, what people are grappling with day in and day out, that most people hold so privately to themselves. You know what they say, what's the line? I think it's by Pascal. Most people suffer in quiet desperation, struggle in quiet desperation. So to become acquainted with one's brothers is to know their problems, their struggles, what they grapple with, and to go through a process of learning to love them. And that experience of becoming acquainted, of letting people unpack who they are and growing into the love that you can have for them. He said that was the supreme experience of living, the ultimate, the pinnacle. That's powerful. And I think it just sets the priority. It sets the stage for us to think about, how did he do this? And how can we tap into that sense of priority and that sense of energy and motivation and inspiration and exhilaration and excitement, really, to get to know people and love them. I don't think it's natural in our animal nature. So I think it's really a genuine and deep spiritual phenomenon that really flows from the connection with God. So our focus this afternoon is on these questions. What was his purpose in all of this personal ministry? And how did he accomplish these purposes? And for me, one of the clearest presentations of his purposes and his methods is in this one, it's quite a long, quite detailed paragraph in paper 132 at section 4. And it describes how he went about his personal ministry. So let's go ahead and take an initial look at it. And we'll just read through it quickly first, and then we're going to unpack it a little bit and get into its depths, because there's a lot here that the midwayers share with us. Always the burden of his message was the fact of the Heavenly Father's love and the truth of his mercy. Those are two interrelated but separate things. The fact of his love and the truth of his mercy. And we'll get into what that means. Coupled with the good news that man is a faith son of this same God of love. And I think were he speaking today, he would have said, men and women are faith sons and daughters of this same God of love. Jesus' usual technique of social contact was to draw people out and into talking with him by asking them questions. The interview would usually begin by his asking them questions and end by their asking him questions. And he was equally adept. Now, this is an art form that really deserves its own workshop, right? He was equally adept in teaching by either asking or answering questions. As a rule, to those he taught the most, he said the least. So what you would see, if you were sort of the fly on the wall, is the other person was talking a lot and Jesus wasn't talking a lot. But he would, at key points, ask questions, and he would listen. Let's go on and read it. He taught the most. Those who derived most benefit from his personal ministry were overburdened, anxious, and dejected mortals who gained much relief because of the opportunity to unburden their souls to a sympathetic and understanding listener. And he was all that and more. So, yeah, hold on. Let's go back one. Because the last part of that is really related to the sentence, to those he taught the most, he said the least. Right? He was allowing them to unpack what they were carrying as their burden. And we need to understand that most people, large majority of people, are in that situation. And they don't have any opportunity to really share who they are. They move along through life privately. And so we have opportunities waiting all around us if we'll just get below the surface to share with people and really allow them to let us come to know them and love them. Yeah, go ahead, Tim. And when these maladjusted human beings had told Jesus about their troubles, and you know, I was a little uncomfortable with a maladjusted word. But you know, as I began to think about it, all of us are maladjusted. And it's interesting to me that the word they use for this presence of God inside of us is the adjuster. That's interesting. So all of us start out in a place where things are really kind of all screwed up in the way we're put together, in the way we function, right? We're animal beings. It's not that we're bad. It's just that we're early. We are primitive. We are young. We're ill-developed, right? And this presence of God is slowly but surely tweaking us, adjusting us, maturing us, helping us to grow in an infinite and eternal trajectory of development, right? So we are maladjusted. That's not a bad thing. It's an inherent thing. And it's not sinful. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about young and immature, right? We're early in our development. And so when these maladjusted human beings had told Jesus about their troubles, always was he able to offer practical and immediately helpful suggestions, looking toward the correction of their real difficulties. We're going to take this apart a little. Albeit he did not neglect to speak words of present comfort and immediate consolation. And invariably would he tell these distressed mortals about the love of God and impart the information by various and sundry methods. He was very creative. He did all kinds of different things, but he was headed in the same direction all the time, that they were the children of this loving Father in heaven. Okay, Tim. So as we look at this passage, it seems to make clear that in all of his work, Jesus had one overriding or primary purpose and a number of secondary purposes. So we're going to read through it again, and let's unpack it a bit to see what the midwares are trying to tell us about his purposes and how he accomplished them. This is the first paragraph, and then I'm going to ask Tim to switch up and down briefly to the last paragraph in the section. Let's take a look at it, because what's interesting is they're saying exactly the same thing with slightly different variation in the first sentence of the paragraph and the last section of the paragraphs. Always, that means without exception, every time he did personal ministry, he talked with probably thousands of human beings. The burden of his message was the fact that God loves us, that this parent that's with us all the time, that we are children of God, that this parent that is within us and with us all the time not only loves us, but is merciful, really understands our condition, and totally accepts us as we are. That's a very powerful message for most people, and that they can actually enter into a living moment-to-moment relationship with that presence. That's transformative. You know, even now, after 50 years of working with it, it still gives me chills to think about the import of what that means for each one of us. So that's the first paragraph. And then, Tim, if we could skip up to the one more. We're going to the last paragraph in the section, which is also bolded. So that's the last paragraph in the section, right? They're saying essentially the same thing, invariably. So again, he did this all the time. Would he tell these distressed mortals, again, the love of God, there's real affection for us, and impart the information by these various and sundry methods, that the nature of the relationship is a parent-child relationship, right? We're treasured as the creation of this being that made us. And that's happening in us in every moment. And he always, invariably, shared that with the people that he talked with. So let's go up and look at the middle paragraphs. So he would ask them questions. That's how he began this process. And he was really good with his questions. He had learned how to ask a question in a way that suggested enough of an answer that the person, someone earlier was talking about getting people engaged in writing and thinking. I think it was Alice. The key is to get people engaged in their own creative process, as Alice was describing, right? So he knew how to ask a question with enough lead-in and enough suggestion as to what he was hoping they would discover in asking them the question, that they would discover it on their own. They would go through a creative process of generating it in response to the questions he was asking. And he was really good at that. So that's a skill set that I think we can work toward trying to develop, to ask questions in a way that leads forward toward a truth. And it's interesting. He would begin by asking them lots of questions, which they would probably find a little odd at first, but then they would relax into it. And then end by them asking him questions. And he was equally good at teaching either way. either by asking or answering questions. And the next slide. So again, I want to say he listened a lot, and he listened a very certain way. They felt him loving them as he was listening. It emanated from him. And that's something that I think we can do as well in our own small way if we're plugged into God's presence while we're doing it. And so this, for me, has probably been one of the most important skills that I've tried to develop over the last 30, 40 years, is how to be functioning inwardly and outwardly at the same time. How to be connected with God's presence and allowing God's love to flow into me so it can flow out of me to that person I'm talking with. So I can love them with the kind of love that God's loving me and loving them. And you can describe it easily. Doing it is a bit of a challenge. It's a process challenge. But I think we can get good at it, and that's what Jesus was the master at doing. He was constantly plugged into God's presence, the Father's presence, and allowing the power of that presence to move through him to other people. Next slide. No, let's see. I think we want to go on to the next slide, Tim. Yeah, we've... See what comes after that one. No, okay, go back. Okay, stick with that. No, one more back. Good. Maybe let's see if this... Oh yeah, that's working now. So the two other things I want to... There are a few things here in this middle section. Practical and immediately helpful suggestions. He really talked to the situation they were sharing with him and gave him some practical suggestions, and he was also very comforting and offering immediate consolation. So he was encouraging. He offered them hope. Looks like that's there twice. Okay, let's go up, and one more. So what I've tried to do, because I think there's a lot of information here in this paragraph, I've tried to kind of summarize it. And so for me, this is his one overriding purpose, right? And the reason that helping them to get into a saving relationship with God, meaning they were really doing relationship with God. It's not that they just believed in God, but they were interacting with God, seeking, listening, sensing the presence of God, allowing the presence of God to move them with God's will. So actually entering into that relationship. And the reason that was so critical for him is because that was the make it or break it move, right? If they did that, they survived and had eternal life. That's the pearl of great price, is living relationship with God. If they get nothing else and they get that, they're on their way. So that's why I think that was his clear overriding priority. And he always stayed focused on that purpose. So let's go to the next slide, please, Tim. And then there were these four underlying purposes. And all I'm doing is sort of taking that paragraph apart and trying to put it in a form that's a little more easy to assimilate, right? So he would do these first two things together, like a bundle. He'd get to know them, love them, and form relationship with them. And he did that by learning about their lives, their troubles, their challenges, allowing them to unburden themselves. And he would tuck in his spiritual teaching as he was getting to know them. He just got good at doing that. And I think we've all tried to do this kind of stuff, but I think we need to really stay at it and just get better and better at it. And then he did comfort them, and he did offer them practical, helpful suggestions. Okay, I think that's most of what I want to share with you. Oh, there's one other thing about this. Let's go back one. There's one other thing about this, and that is, I mentioned it before, but I think it's worth focusing on. when we try to do this, Jesus is with us, whispering to us as the Spirit of truth. We are not doing this alone. So he knew how to do this, and he learned how to do it really effectively, and he's trying to teach us how to do it as we try to do it ourselves, right? It's a living practice session, and the Master's here with us. I kind of feel him just over my shoulder, whispering, try this, try that, check that out. So stay alive to the presence of the Spirit of truth as you do ministry. I think that's especially when the Spirit of truth is active, is when we attempt to minister. Okay, then the last thing I want to talk about is this question. Because these purposes are fairly simple. They're really elemental and really critically important, but they're fairly simple. And we're kind of in this odd situation where we have this huge text with a lot of information that helps us engage in these purposes, but it has a lot of other information, right? So how do we fold the Urantia book, or how do we use the Urantia book in attempting to accomplish this penultimate purpose of helping people enter into a living relationship with God? And so I just want to share a couple of thoughts with you. And again, this is my way of thinking about it. This is very personal stuff, and you may come to a different conclusion, but it's kind of how I see it. I think we work with the Urantia book in the attempting to do this really only if it actually helps with a particular individual to accomplish that primary purpose and the secondary purposes. And if you think about the nature of this task, it's primarily talking and sharing. And it's primarily listening to another person sharing who they are. So putting the book in front of them, showing this all kinds of stuff about the Urantia book is not quite the same thing as listening to who a person is and allowing them to unburden themselves. It seems somewhat discrepant as a tool for those sets of purposes. But I would say when you encounter someone especially who's a seeker who clearly wants more detailed information about this relationship, about the spiritual life, about the cosmos, stay alert to that. If you know them already, and then you can approach with the book. But I would say my practice is if I don't know someone and I'm just getting to know them and I'm trying to engage in some helpful conversation with them, I don't mention it. I leave it aside as I get to know them. And then if it seems like it would be helpful in accomplishing these purposes, so these purposes are the primary order of business. The book is a means to the end of accomplishing these things, in my mind. Then bring it in, right, if it'll help accomplish them. And if it seems discrepant with who they are, what they're sharing, or might even cause them to disengage and go away, I would leave it out. So that's just me, but we all have to kind of figure out how the book plays a part in our ministry. But that we focus on these priorities and try to get good at doing what Jesus did, I think it's a universal. I think it's something all of us should be thinking about and trying to work with. So I think that's probably enough for me, and I've got a handout that summarizes some of this stuff. If any of you want a copy of it, just come down, pick it up. It's a little two-sided sheet. And then I just hope your conversations in the workshops are very, very rich and fruitful. Thank you.